You are not here by accident. We are standing at the edge of possibilities between what is, what could, and what will be. Where time, space, and humanity cross paths. Where the future has stopped being theory as old assumptions fade away and new realities are becoming real. Are you ready to step beyond the familiar? Look no further and enter the third horizon.
Before we begin, let us step back for a moment. In the last 2 episodes, we explored 2 ideals civilizations depend on but often forget: memory and time. In episode 6, we examined historical amnesia, how societies repeat costly mistakes when they disconnect themselves from the lessons of the past. In episode 7, we explored the illusion of the isolated present, the ideal that the moment we inhabit can somehow stand alone, detached from both memory and responsibility. But memory and time alone do not hold a civilization together. History shows something more complicated. Civilizations bend, they strain, they face crisis, and yet many do not collapse. Something holds. Tonight, we explore that question. Not what causes civilizations to fail, but what allows them to endure. And joining me again for this conversation is someone who has worked inside political systems and governance structures for decades. Lembit Opik served in the British Parliament and is currently serves as the Speaker of the Asgardia Space Nation Parliament, an emerging digital democracy exploring governance beyond traditional borders. Lembit, welcome back.
Thanks so much indeed, John, for your very kind introduction.
You are most welcome, Lembit. And as always, I want to make sure I say this time because I missed it last time. It is an honor to have you on my show.
It's completely mutual. And I have to say, you have sold this so well, John. I studied philosophy at university. And so therefore, when you set up the interview as you have, it's just like being back at the University of Bristol philosophy department again.
Well, that might be some good memories.
Great memories.
There you go.
Studying philosophy teaches you how to think about things. And I guess that's what we're about to do now.
Absolutely. There were nights in 1940 when London burned. Sirens echoed through the streets. Families gathered children, blankets, and whatever they could carry before descending into underground stations. Bombs fell across neighborhoods, churches, train stations, and markets. For 57 consecutive nights, the sky glowed red with fire. And yet, something remarkable happened. The city did not empty. Government did not dissolve. Courts did not permanently suspend. Trains ran again when tracks were repaired. Newspapers printed the next morning. Schools reopened. Daily life, fragile as it was, continued. Not because there was no fear, but because something held. Lembit, when you look at Britain during the Blitz, what do you think actually held that society together?
Those hierarchy of needs. Let me explain that. Around the same time, there was a very clever man called Abraham Maslow, and he tried to work out what motivates us, not you and me, the whole of the human race, and arguably all of living things. And he came to the view that there were 5 elements to it. We don't have to go through all of them, but the fundamental one was survival. Above that, safety and security. Above that, love and belonging. We don't need to go beyond that. But basically, what happened was the society recognized it was do or die. And conventional differences, arguments, things that may seem important, whether it's your favorite football team or your favorite color or whether you like your neighbor or not, those were subjugated to the fundamental need to survive. And I think what brought Britain together was that collective value. Now, there's something else as well, which we might get into a little bit more in the conversation, John. But I think also life was a little bit more simple then. It wasn't like atomized into bits. People tended to be struggling much more than they do in the 21st century. There were still things which were hard. And so therefore there was a common strand of experience, if you like. certainly amongst the working classes and the middle classes. Maybe not so much the upper classes, the super rich and powerful. And so when Germany started bombing London, everybody had the same mentality, the survival instinct. And they decided to work together to survive. And that character unquestionably prevented the disintegration of society that you've been asking about.
Yes, well, that connects nicely to the broader theme that we're talking about tonight. Leadership matters too. Winston Churchill had made controversial decisions earlier in his political career. He was not universally admired, and even within government, there were doubts about his judgment. But in 1940, something changed. Churchill understood that the battle Britain faced was not only a military effort, it was psychological. In one of his most famous wartime speeches, he told the British people, we shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. Those words did more than inspire. They reframed the moment. Fear narrows time. Leadership widens it. And when leaders widen time, societies often find the strength to endure. The Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote that what stands in the way becomes the way. History shows that civilizations often discover their resilience precisely when circumstances seem most overwhelming. Lambit, given the history of your country as I have portrayed it here, do you feel Winston Churchill reframed the moment and widened the time horizon for the United Kingdom only, or did his efforts inspire a worldview?
Yes, yes, and yes. If you ask people who discuss these things, especially historians, who is the greatest Briton, almost always it is Winston Churchill that wins out. There have been some great Brits. Isaac Newton, with Newtonian physics, defined the rules that got us to the moon. We've got great artists and great orators, great writers, Oscar Wilde, and so many more. Winston Churchill wins that contest because he literally saved us from the dark tyranny of Nazism. And so for the first question that you asked, Winston Churchill was the right man at the right moment. He wasn't a good peace leader, not particularly, but as a war leader, and he didn't start World War II as leader. He took over from others who were perhaps less effective. But as a war leader, he had the resilience, not just to give this little island the courage to fight back, but he gave the confidence to your country, the United States of America, to invest in that success. And there was a point at which the United States could have, in fact, simply done a deal with Hitler and said, okay, you keep Europe, but leave us alone. Now, that may have been an insanely dangerous thing to do, but it was a possibility. But because Winston Churchill had such resolve and what we might call now the special relationship at the time, his endeavor, his courage, his conviction changed the game. Now, that leads to the second point. His oratory was superb. We shall never surrender, as he said. And I'm quite pleased with that myself, actually. Thank you.
He actually sounded almost like him.
We shall fight them on the beaches. I actually train in public speaking, and I use that speech as one of the greatest speeches of all time, one of the most important speeches of all time, right up there with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which incidentally he made a number of times. It wasn't just in Washington. Now, with Winston Churchill, he told a country that was losing the war, that couldn't see a way forward to carry on. The reason he talked about fighting in the streets and in the fields is because it looked at that point as if the Nazis could cross the channel and literally lay claim to the United Kingdom. So it was actually a speech preparing for a land invasion. But it's a timeless speech, and you read it correctly. And I think the second thing, his oratory was superb. Third part of your question, did it change the worldview? I think so, because shortly after World War II, the Cold War began, when two allies, namely the Soviet Union and, say, Britain and America, which at that point reigned supreme, those three countries, because they've defeated Nazism. They fell apart. And you had America and UK on one side, and you had the Soviet Union on the other. So after what has to be regarded as one of the greatest war leadership displays in human history, ironically, Winston Churchill lost the general election in 1945. You think would have been rewarded by Britain, but Britain wanted a new start, and so he lost for various reasons. But his reputation was unimpeachable. And so he defined the words of the Cold War. And it was he who said, "An iron curtain has descended across Europe," and so forth. He defined that, but he also defined the courage and the resolve and the clarity of thought that, in his view, were required to stand up against that dark threat.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, that's right along the lines that I understood it to be like too. Winston Churchill, I've always been an admirer of him. I've studied him for some time. And I've watched every movie to come out with Winston Churchill in it, I think the best one that they got was that Darkest Hour. I think that was the most accurate, portrayal of him. But even the actor looked a lot like him. But yeah, he's definitely a great person in history.
That film I like too. I find it slightly frustrating in a sense. I wanted to have more victory in it. It's hard to explain it, but I agree with you. It did show something of the man's resolve. There are some great series. I won't start promoting them now because we haven't got time. But universally, they recognize a man of greatness. Many of them brush over his weaknesses, but those weaknesses pale into insignificance considering the immortal contribution he did to free the world from one of the darkest sects in human history, namely Nazism.
Absolutely. Civilizations rarely hold together through force alone. They hold together through sheer meaning. Shared understanding of why sacrifice matters. A shared belief that the struggle is larger than the moment offers another powerful example. On December the 7th, 1941, Japan attacked United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. The shock was immediate, but what followed was something remarkable. Within days, one of the largest mobilizations in American history began. Factories converted to wartime production. Millions volunteered for military service. Civilian industries reorganized around a common effort. A tragedy had been transformed into purpose. Part of that transformation came through leadership. In the days following the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation and famously described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. That speech did more than just condemn an attack. It reframed the moment to inspire a nation far beyond fear, worry, and doubt. Then, expanding the horizon to a national shared purpose with a long view meaning. Grief became resolve. Shock became unity. Sacrifice became meaningful. In that moment, Americans were not simply reacting to an event, they were participating in a shared story about what the nation was fighting for. And when people believe their sacrifices are part of something larger than themselves, cohesion becomes possible even in the face of immense pressure. Lembit, do you think modern political systems still create this shared meaning, or have they become more fragmented than before?
You've loaded me up with a lot of pressure, given your soliloquy there. If I disagree with you, you can cut me off. But let me take a risk and share with you an element of a public speech, which I've made many times on cruise ships. I used to work on cruise ships. In fact, long before I met you, I was looking at this very issue, the nature of leadership. And I came to the following view, and partly because of that Maslowian system, Maslow's hierarchy of need. When people are in great danger, they pull together. The community protects itself. The genetic survival instinct means that people who might otherwise disagree work together for common survival. In times of peace, we move on to another level in Maslow's hierarchy of need, and that's self-esteem. It's the second highest as far as Maslow was concerned, highest being self-actualization. Some would say a spiritual realization. But if you get to self-esteem, then it's about backing the right horse, supporting the right football team, having a bigger house than your neighbor. And those are all comfortable things you can do if you're not threatened with your very survival. So my answer is actually short and quite simple. When we have the luxury to do it, we would rather compete on clothes, on shoes, on cars, on partners to an extent, on houses, on the things that we can mutually compare each other over, which are not actually life and death. You described Pearl Harbor, and there's a whole industry of conspiracy theory about what President Roosevelt knew and what he didn't. But there is no doubt that at that moment, America was profoundly threatened. Essentially, for the first time in its independent history, its territory had been attacked. And that frightened America and caused the result that you described. I watched a series, it might have been called Masters of the Air or something like that, about Boeing B-17 bomber pilots. It's an absolutely enthralling series, beautifully filmed, and lots of AI in it. And it was about people in their teens and 20s who risked their lives in the defense of the realm, by which I mean America, but also the United Kingdom. And what caused them to do it? Partly, it must have been the thrill. Partly, I don't know if you remember this, John, but that inescapable belief in your 20s that you're indestructible. But also, it's quite obvious that it was to fight a just war. And in the 40s, that was a very real thing. So I would summarize what I've said there as a case study in personal leadership. Those people, mainly men, aviators, one and all, who fought and flew, met women, especially in the camps and the aerodromes of Britain, and together they loved the commitment of what they did. They didn't celebrate the danger, but they didn't question the importance of doing it. You know, John, the question you've asked me reminds me of the human race at its very best. And we look back, we celebrated Churchill. He didn't die in the war, but millions did, and thousands of aviators did too, precisely because they had that common cause. And I have to say the free world is forever in their debt.
I agree. And you kind of touched on that in episode 5 when you said that, you do things for the greater good, and it might not benefit you, but you're doing it for the greater good, and you have that spirit of you, and that's why you're doing what you're doing. So, yeah, I agree.
To an extent, anyone with children understands that when, as a wonderful artist friend of mine said to me not long ago, she said, when you have children, you stop being the picture and start being the frame. What's most impressive is many of the aviators, that's the example I'm using, many of the servicemen who died and servicewomen who died in Pearl Harbor, they didn't have children, and they were serving a higher cause. And many of them went to their graves without ever having children, but they still served that collective good. And I'm not sure, even though we're having this profound conversation, John, that we'll ever fully understand, or to be more precise, appreciate the mindset of sacrifice that must have gone with that.
Absolutely. Well, modern research on societal resilience confirms something historians have long suspected. Communities with strong shared narratives recover from crisis faster than those without them, because hardship is interpreted differently, not as chaos, but as challenge. Lembit, have you ever experienced a moment in politics or your own leadership where shared purpose helped people navigate a crisis more effectively?
That's a personal question and a profound one. Yes, I have. And the example that comes most to mind in politics, in the world of politics, is this. I grew up in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland if you come from certain parts of the world. And that nuance is important in terms of the wording. And people literally killed each other for the sake of a cause. And it was frightening. I've seen explosions in the street. I've heard gunfire that has killed people. And in those circumstances, you might think the society would never become united. The greatest honor I ever had in British politics as being the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. What that meant was I was right in the heart of the peace process from the beginning to the end. Outside Northern Ireland, I was the only politician with an official title that saw the whole decade of the peace process. And I sat in rooms with people with guns, people who'd killed people. And what solved the problem was finding that common cause. It wasn't to identify the differences. We knew the differences, but it was to say what unites us. Because I can tell you now that on the whole, any two people who grew up in Belfast have more in common than they have with somebody from not Belfast, somebody from London, for example. And so the whole process was to do exactly what's inferred in your question, to find what unites us, not what divides us. And, from that experience, I've learned that there is so little difference between human beings all over the world. Why do we fight at all?
Exactly. I can't say that I've ever experienced anything like that. It just hurts my heart to hear a story like that. But I know that
I went to school. Sorry, I'm talking over you, but I will share this. I went to a school right in the heart of Belfast, and they had strips of tape on the windows just in case there was a bomb so that the glass wouldn't shatter across the pupils. And I've been to reunions of my school, and there should be one this year, actually, now I think about it. Some of them are in wheelchairs because they had their legs blown off in the Troubles. They were in the army or in the police, and they were shot. So the scars of that time live on in my year group. But John, even then, I've learned, and there's a story which is too personal for me to share, but I'll put it this way. It is possible that I've met people who've shot my friends, but even then you have a choice. I'm a man of faith, and I say to myself as a man of faith, do I carry that resentment and suspicion with me for the rest of my life? Or do I forgive? And I can do nothing other than forgive.
Absolutely. Well, now it's time for a short break. So now a word for our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is brought to you by Coin Toss Coffee, a brand built on passion, family, and the bold leap into possibility. Every blend is handcrafted from Kevin's own recipes, including their best-selling cowboy roast, bold, smooth, and unforgettable. And right now, listeners of The Third Horizon can enjoy 10% off their order at cointosscoffee.com using promo code Horizon10. That is cointosscoffee.com. Coin Toss Coffee. Take a chance on a better cup.
Another stabilizing force is trust. Trust between citizens. Trust in institutions. Trust that the systems will behave predictably even during crisis. When trust disappears, even strong systems can collapse. History offers a powerful example. During the early years of the Great Depression, thousands of American banks failed. Confidence vanished almost overnight. Citizens rushed to withdraw their savings, accelerating the collapse. People did not simply fear losing money. They feared the entire system might fail. Restoring that trust required more than reassuring speeches. It required visible action. The Roosevelt administration introduced a series of structural reforms that came to be known as the New Deal. Deposit insurance guaranteed that ordinary citizens would not lose their savings if banks failed. But the rebuilding of trust went even further. Massive public works programs put millions of Americans back to work. Projects like Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and thousands of bridges, roads, and public buildings began to reshape the physical landscape of the country. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration employed millions in conservation, infrastructure, and community projects. And the creation of the Social Security Administration established a long-term commitment to economic security to future generations. These policies did more than stimulate the economy. They demonstrated that institutions could act, adapt, and respond. Confidence slowly returned. Trust was rebuilt. Modern research in political science confirms something historians have long observed. Societies with higher institutional trust are far more resilient during crisis because citizens believe the systems around them will continue to function even under pressure. Lambit, from your experience inside political systems, let me ask you something. What erodes public trust faster? Incompetence or inconsistency?
Inconsistency. None of us is perfect. And there's a great deal of incompetence in politics and in industry. But it's the inconsistency that makes people feel distrustful. Read my lips, no more taxes. And then you increase the taxes. What's there to trust? In the United Kingdom, a good example was when Keir Starmer went, if you elect us, we promise change. Yeah, okay, the change has all been worse, or mainly been worse. So it's the inconsistency which breaks the trust. And that's because inconsistency looks like a lie. We all screw up from time to time, as parents, as workers, as friends. But if you've got good faith, then people will be forgiving. But if you're inconsistent, it can look cynical. And that's what hurts.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, when trust erodes, even capable systems struggle to function. But when trust survives, even imperfect systems can endure. Civilizations that survive crisis rarely abandon procedure. Courts continue operating. Legislators convene. Transitions of authority remain lawful. Continuity signals stability. Even when circumstances are unstable, long-term thinking is not just about strategy. It is something much deeper. When you look at history, whether it is the medieval builders constructing cathedrals that would take centuries to complete, or the founders of nations designing constitutions meant to endure generations, the societies that last are the ones that think beyond the immediate moment. They imagine the world their grandchildren will inherit. Lambit, do institutions today still think in decades or mostly in election cycles?
Well, there isn't one answer to that. But in keeping with giving you direct answers, politicians think in electoral cycles. Well-meaning institutions can think in decades or centuries. So you might think of the Royal Astronomical Society in the United Kingdom, which isn't trying to get elected or to rule the world. They can talk about millennia or longer, eons, and they're not desperate to try to prove themselves every 5 years. On the other hand, when you look at political organizations like political parties, they live in the electoral cycle. And they'll say something like, well, let's make these promises now. We know they won't work over 10 years, but we only need to make it through 5. And that's one of the reasons I don't really like party politics, because party politicians are part of larger organizations which are fighting for their own survival as an end in itself. And that can be detrimental to the long-term well-being of the world. Some people like the Dalai Lama, others don't, but the Dalai Lama takes a long-term view. I think it was Chairman Mao, the one-time leader of China, who was asked what he thought of a revolution from hundreds of years ago. And he said, it's too soon to say. And that's the thing. If you look at the big picture, then it does take a long time. I'll finish with this on this question. I used to be the deputy chair of the all-party parliamentary group on China. So I had the honor of going there, and I'm very enamored with China. Some of your viewers may not like that, but I was very impressed. And when I was there in 1999, I think, I went to Hong Kong as a guest of the Chinese government. They told me what they were planning about expanding their economy, about becoming a huge economic superpower, about their political ambitions. And they were patient. They said, well, wait, we'll do this over decades. And they're carrying it out. And to me, John, the greatest politicians are those who plant the tree knowing that it'll be their offspring who sit in its shadow.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a good quote. That's a good.
I wish I could take credit for it. Somebody said it to me a few days ago. I thought it was really good.
I've actually used that on my podcast too. It's a good one. Yes, it is. It's a good one. Well, we're going to take another quick break for our sponsors. So here's another word for our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is also brought to you by FCA, Fine Consulting Agency. If you need high-level policy analysis, structured research, or strategic writing tailored for government, space governance, or nonprofit sectors, FCA delivers clarity, organization, and deep insight. Learn more at FCAOnline.info, that is FCAOnline.info.
There is one final stabilizing force, the ability to adapt without collapsing. NASA faced this test after the Challenger disaster. Instead of hiding failure, the agency conducted one of the most detailed accident investigations in modern history. Systems were redesigned, procedures were re-examined, knowledge was preserved, failure became instruction, and the program continued. Closed environments magnify instability. Open environments of transparency allow meaningful solutions to emerge, which builds cohesion, shared meaning, and trust. Lembit, from your perspective, what type of environments work best in government? Open or closed?
You'd expect me, because it's a leading question, to say open, but that's not always the case. Using your NASA example, I would say the very best case study in openness was the investigation that followed the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, in January 1967. I think it may have been the 27th of January. I can't remember exactly now, where Roger Chaffee, Gus Grissom, and Ed White were burned to death because of inadequacies in the command module in a full-up test on the launch pad. Gus Grissom may have been the first man on the moon had that not occurred. It was a national tragedy, and you'll know this more than I do. And the only reason, in my view, why Apollo got there before the Russian program is because they did a root and branch review. They honestly looked at the spacecraft and made enormous changes. They basically built a new spacecraft. And to me, that was a case study in open government, if you like. By contrast, a lot of what happens in politics is closed, and what happens then is the secrets end up being concealed by secrets, and that means that the system becomes incredibly sticky and covered in treacle and limited in its outcome, and I think that's unhealthy.
It becomes a slippery slope.
Well, yeah, because what happens is once you've told people to be secret, then you have to have other people telling secrets to keep the secrets. You could argue that the entire sordid Epstein palaver is an example of that, where you've got warehousefuls of data, which for some inexplicable reason, not that inexplicable, hasn't yet been shared. And so all of that would say open government's good. But there are times when that doesn't work. We talked about Churchill before. In World War II, people were keeping secrets. I'm not sure how well they kept them, but some of them we know to be very well kept. So, for example, the Enigma machine, one of the most fantastic coding machines ever invented at the time, certainly by the Germans, involved a very, very clever encryption system. And there's a whole body of films and everything else about that. The Imitation Game is a film I recommend you watch about that. And then secrets were important. But that was because to share those secrets, to open those secrets, could have altered the course of the war. So not in every case is complete openness beneficial. But here's the biggest point. If you are open on the whole, in most circumstances, you can actually do away with the threat of war in the first place. Because if I was Prime Minister in Britain, I would say I have no intention of using my nuclear deterrent. And that can create stability too. So I don't think it's an open and shut answer, John, because it depends on the circumstances. But all other things being equal, if you show your palms and show that you're not holding a knife, it generally makes you less likely to be attacked.
Well, I think that if it has to deal with the safety and security, then yes, certainly there needs to be some secret there. I mean, you mentioned World War II, and you look at FDR. A lot of people didn't even know that he was crippled. That he didn't have use of his legs they took a photo of him not being able to get in the car, crippled, real early before, but they didn't never publish the photo until years after the war was over, and they said it would make him look weak, and so they never published it. But in situations like that, I can certainly see where that would hold true. But there are situations. It seems like today there are situations that are held secret that shouldn't be. Especially when the public of whatever institution you're running, and the public is part of that institution, and they're not just there as a because they're not just there as observers, but they're there as a participating party. In those situations, I think that they have the right to information. And here in America, we do have a program that allows you to request information, and they're supposed to come up with it. And the only information they will not give you is, of course, something that would violate.
We've got a Freedom of Information Act here, but it's become quite obvious to me that it's selective. When the deep state is threatened, you don't get the data. And I actually think you made a very interesting observation there, John. I actually think that you can get the data when the state's not threatened. But when you actually stand to expose wrongdoing in the state, it's a terrible job to get the information. And I simply, once again, cite the Epstein files for that.
Okay. Well, let's stick on topic here. Okay.
I'm not expecting to talk about it tonight. And perhaps those who are viewing this maybe a few months or a year or two from now will find out if I'm right about that. But the position that I'm taking still stands. When you want information that doesn't threaten authority, you can get it. When you want information that does threaten authority, it's very hard to get it.
Absolutely.
I perhaps have been almost naive in my political life because I didn't mind people knowing stuff. I was in the press a lot. A lot of what they wrote about me was rubbish, but it didn't really bother me that much because I didn't take it seriously. Maybe I should have taken it more seriously. But when it comes to the really important stuff, when the going gets tough, the tough get shredding. And that's the difficult thing because those tough nuts will do anything to protect themselves. And perhaps that's a subject for a completely different show.
Well, research shows that people that keep secrets, it tends to break down cohesion. And people that are more open, it tends to build cohesion up. So, and I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. In space, cohesion becomes survival. Shared meaning becomes infrastructure. Trust becomes oxygen. Even today, scientists are studying these challenges. Space agencies conduct long-duration isolation experiments where astronauts live together in scaled environments for months at a time. Projects like Biosphere 2 explored how humans survive when closed ecological systems or within closed ecological systems. One lesson appears again and again. Technology is rarely the hardest challenge. Human cooperation is. Lembit, let me ask a simple question. If humanity builds a settlement on the moon someday, what will matter more, technology or trust?
Technology has to come first in the environment you're discussing, because however much you trust somebody, if all the air gets out, you're all dead. So you have to get the tech right. If you're on an airplane next to someone you hate, you still want the plane to work. The second thing then in the longer term is trust. So the tech in the remarkably, notably, intensely inhospitable environment of space has to come first.
Right.
Then you've got the luxury of society.
But the tech itself will not stand alone. It actually, you have to put your trust not only in the tech, but the people who made the tech and the people who are running the tech. So,
but you gave me a dilemma. You didn't tell me I could have them both.
Yeah.
So it's
you
tech
can have
one, just two.
You can have whatever you want.
All right. If we were in a car and I thought one of the wheels was going to come off, I wouldn't be saying, I don't trust you, John. I said, let me out. The tech's not going to work. Yeah, yes, but I want the mechanic to get the tech right. We can have an argument about whether I trust you or not after that. So the tech has to come first. The tech has to come first.
The tech, I mean, like in a car, and I say this all the time, the tech is a tool, and a tool is only as good as the person wielding it. So if the people wielding the tool are basically ignorant, it's not going to work for them. And not as well as, not as well as they think. And it may carry them along for a little bit as far as the limits of that tool, but eventually the system itself, whatever it is that you're using the tool on, can actually outstage the limits of the tool. And that's where human reason comes in. So for human reason to create cohesion, there has to be a trust there.
If you don't want to agree with me, it's your show. You can agree.
No.
You can edit all of this out if you want.
That's observation. That's all it is.
But my observation back at you is quite simple. You have to have a survivable environment before you can have an argument, because otherwise everyone's dead. So the number one thing that has to happen is the boat doesn't sink, the plane doesn't crash, the lights come on, the people don't starve. Once you've got that, then you can have the trust debate. But to be blunt, if one person's starving and the other person says, "Do you love me?" the first person probably isn't going to say, "That wasn't top of my list." And this is the thing. I think that our mission, this is a heavy comment coming up now, John. I think our mission in life, mission on this little pale blue dot hanging in the darkness of space, is to secure our survival first so that we can do whatever it is that we've been sent here to this universe to do. Survive, one, think, two. And I think that's the way it is. If there are only two things that we can take from this world to the next when we die, it would be love and wisdom. Neither of those are the technical element. But in order to spend 70 or 80 years here, the tech has to work. And if you're living on the moon, you can't have a leak in the window.
Well, before humanity builds settlements beyond Earth, we must understand what holds Earth societies together. Civilizations endure when several forces align: shared meaning, trust between citizens, institutions that maintain continuity, and systems capable of adapting under pressure. But cohesion depends on something deeper: shared understanding. And we are entering an age where complexity may be growing faster than comprehension, when citizens no longer understand the system that governs them. Trust begins to erode. Next week, we explore that challenge: the widening complexity gap. This podcast is not about blame. This podcast is not about taking sides. This podcast is about discovery and exploring the deeper meaning behind the human experience and the systems that shape it. If you are someone who senses the world shifting, if you feel the tension between what is and what could be, if you believe humanity is meant for something more, then welcome. This is The Third Horizon. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. More conversations are coming, deeper, wider, and firmly focused on the future. If you enjoyed this podcast or this episode, hit the like button, let us know in the comments, and subscribe to our YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook channels, or whatever platform you are listening from. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and beyond. And that's it. Thank you, Lembit, for that wonderful episode. Did you enjoy that one?
I love doing this. I find it stimulating. It's midnight.